How many of you remember what it was like when you had to wait in line at a bank? Of course, we look back and it seems quaint because, of course, we can do banking on our phone or even more up to date with things like Square or just literally touchless payments. It's become pretty effortless. And yet, there's one area of our society that really lags technologically because this is still how we relate to government. So you think about that, and what's wrong with this picture? 91% of Americans own a cell phone, 67% use Facebook, 33% have a tablet. Those numbers are going up, and we're still engaging with government through paper forms, through bureaucratic meetings that you have to show up in person. The processes have not kept up, and this breaks trust. So even when government does try to build digital services, they do it badly. You guys, obviously all heard about the failures of healthcare.gov. This was really worth understanding. First of all, the word around Washington is that the only difference between healthcare.gov and every other government IT project is that this one got a lot of press. In other words, they all are over budget, don't work, and are badly designed. Now, some of this is due to bureaucrats who don't know how to manage technology projects, don't know how to buy things. It's due to greedy vendors who are quite happy to charge hundreds of millions of dollars for things that we in Silicon Valley know should at most cost a few million. After all, this was basically a lead generation site for insurance companies. $1 billion? Are you serious? This kind of thing really does break trust in government. If you look at this slide from a Pew report, you can see the fall of trust in government. It went back up during the period when Ronald Reagan was president, fell precipitously, then climbed back up actually to its highest level in modern memory during the period when Bill Clinton was president. You may remember that Al Gore led an effort to reinvent government. They actually did slash the bureaucracy. For the first time, we ran a budget surplus because they did get rid of a lot of bureaucracy. Then, of course, it fell precipitously again during the Bush years and continued its downward slide under Obama. The thing that's so important to understand is as we move into the 21st century, the only way to reverse this trend is for government to start being more effective, to do a better job, because we don't trust it because, not just because of the poisonous politics, but because it's pretty clear that our interests are not first. There's the interests of lobbyists, the interests of vendors, but the citizen is really at the bottom of the heap. But we have to build not just good policy, but also good digital services. Because as Tom Steinberg, who's a UK open government activist, wrote a few years ago, good governance and good policy are now inextricably linked to the digital. Healthcare.gov was the signature policy of this administration, and it nearly failed because they didn't know how to build a digital service. So, as I said, this started with the bad procurement policies, with bad governance, but it really actually begins with this, a 900-plus page bill and tens of thousands of pages of regulation that then were expected, just thrown over the wall to these contracts and said, okay, build a site that implements this. By contrast, the National Highway Bill of 1956, which gave us our interstate highways, was 29 pages long. Congress has gotten in the business of way over-specifying things. I want you to imagine for a minute that 535 lawyers got into a room with a bunch of lobbyists, and they wrote the specifications for a search engine, or a social network, or, a smartphone. Do you think we would have Google, Facebook, Apple? No way. The fundamental process is broken when the policymakers specify all the details without ever engaging with users, without ever actually doing a discovery process, or without ever understanding actually how their policies are going to be implemented. So there's one government agency that's done a really good job of bringing government into the 21st century, and that's the UK's Government Digital Service. There are other highlights, cities around the country that are stepping forward. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which was set up a couple of years ago. But the government digital service in the UK is unique in that the people who are implementing the policies report in at the highest levels of government, directly into the cabinet office, right? So they have access to push back when policies are unimplementable, or to say, wait a minute, that shouldn't cost that much. They're really at the highest level of government. They also brought in super smart technologists so that the GDS was referred to as the hottest startup in London. That's pretty cool, right? But that's actually not the magic. The magic is that they thought about how to build better sites. So this GovUK site actually replaced 1,700 distinct UK government websites with one, which gets more traffic than all 1,700 got beforehand, because they figured out what do people really want from this site. Just the same way that a Silicon Valley site has to figure out what its users want, or it goes away. Government sort of thinks it has a monopoly on these services. Well, you just kind of go ahead, you put out whatever, and people have to use it. But as Jen Polka, the founder of Code for America, likes to say, there is an alternative. It's apathy and distrust of government. So the GDS has this wonderful set of design principles, which in my opinion are the most important user interface documents since the original Macintosh human interface guidelines back in the early 80s. They really outline how do you build a digital service, particularly in a sort of corporate or government setting. What does the process look like? And it's so fascinating. The very first principle is to start with needs. And I love that it says user needs, not government needs. Because, of course, what happens so often in a government context is the agencies have all kinds of requirements, and that is what drives the design of the site. Rather than thinking about, well, what are actual citizens trying to get out of this site? And a lot of what we've tried to do at Code for America is to internalize these principles and to teach cities how to build sites and to build services that actually meet their citizens' needs. So our primary and original program is something called the Code for America Fellowship. It's a year-long program where people like you, technologists, take a year and you go work in small startup teams in cities working on interesting and hard problems that are potentially replicable so that the software can be shared with other cities. So the fellowship team you see there, 3 people who went to New Orleans, worked on a project called Blight Status. They've now since formed a company called Civic Insight. But basically, the city of New Orleans had been told that it would take years and millions of dollars and a complete refit of their systems in order for them to have information about the status of blighted properties in the city. The fellows went in there, and in 6 weeks, they had a first working prototype, right? Because the fact is, it was not that hard a problem. It was just something that the existing systems and the existing vendors were not really willing to tackle using modern technology. So we show cities what's possible, and that's sort of a culture virus. We also build the apps, which are sometimes redeployed in other cities. But the real key is to get people to understand what's possible. Another great example, and this one really highlights some of the GDS principles, was a project we did in Honolulu back in 2012, where they wanted to redesign their website. And again, with 3 fellows, a little hard to think about rebuilding the entire website, thousands of pages of content, but they came up with an innovative approach. But I want to point out first here's the old Honolulu website that they were facing. And you can't read the tiny type, but the first, it's basically a list of press releases, many of which are about government itself. Here's the mayor's statement on the anniversary of 9/11. Here's the mayor's statement about this and that. It's really not about what citizens are coming to the site for. The fellows built a simple site based on the GovUK model. They called it Honolulu Answers. It's a search engine for questions that citizens might have. So they applied one of the GDS principles, which is design with data. They went and they looked at the search logs. Surprise. They said, what are people actually looking for? And one of the things they found was that one of the top queries, for example, was, how do I get a driver's license? Now, you wouldn't normally think of that as a city function, but Hawaii is a small state, and so the city of Honolulu actually runs that for the state. But what's really fascinating here, you go search for this on the original site. On this page, it's sort of astonishing just how little information there actually is. We have this statement about, we have new photographic scanners. We have rules that we've promulgated 5 years ago. And nowhere is there actually information about what you want to know, which is, for example, how do I get a driver's license? How do I renew my driver's license? What do I do if I lost my driver's license? So the new site has very, very simple answers in plain English. And that's sort of a super important principle. So much government communication is written in a foreign language. And we'll come to that more later. So they actually had this write-a-thon where they got citizens to come in, propose questions. And because of that, you also got questions that government wouldn't normally think to answer, like, what do I do about wild pigs, being a problem? And but then citizens actually wrote answers. But it didn't stop there, because one of the other Code for America programs is the Brigade, which is like a volunteer fire brigade. It's an association of civic hacker groups around the country who go stand up applications, do similar projects. So we took, last year in Oakland, the Honolulu Answers code base, which we pulled down off of GitHub, and we got a write-a-thon together, and we worked on many of these answers. I want to show you one of the answers that I wrote, because again, it highlights this point about user needs first. I wrote an answer to the question, what do I do with old paint, oil, car batteries, and other hazardous waste? Now, there is a hazardous waste site, but again, it's a maze of complicated government information. And I had a very poignant memory of showing up the first time I went there with a bunch of paint cans in the back of my truck and being told, oh, that's too many. We only accept 15 gallons at a time. And I go, well, why didn't they tell me that on the site? Well, it turns out, actually, it is on the site. It's in a footnote on a form that they tell you you might want to download and print beforehand because it might speed things up. They don't think to bring it up because guess what? That's a state requirement. It doesn't have to do with the city's information. Right? So that's sort of the government thinking about their information, their process. I also worked on a similar project with a similar page about bike parking at BART. And there is a page about bike parking at 19th Street. There's another page about bike parking at West Oakland. There's no page that tells you, gosh, there is bike parking at all BART stations. So because apparently each station has its own little organization. So, but is really building better websites that important? Well, I think it is, because if you think about healthcare.gov, that was a disaster. But what we don't realize when we think about what's really at stake in better interfaces to government, I wrote a blog post about this last year, inspired by a quote from Ezra Klein talking about healthcare.gov, who said, "One privilege the insured and well-off have is to excuse the terrible quality of services the government routinely delivers to the poor. Too often the press ignores or simply never knows the pain and trouble of interfacing with government bureaucracies that the poor struggle with daily." I tell you, healthcare.gov has nothing on applying for food stamps. It's a 50-page online form. And this is aimed at people who are least likely to be able to fill it out. So I'm really proud of the work we've done in the last couple of years in human services. So there was a group of fellows worked in San Mateo this last year on building a search engine for social services and an API so that social service agencies could provide their information into the API, and other cities could basically replicate the process. But also in San Francisco, the fellows debugged the process by which people apply for food stamps. It turns out an awful lot of people were being dropped from the rolls and then having to go through the entire application process all over again. And what they found out was that the reason people were being dropped was because they were getting letters like this. Now, the type is too small for me to read out loud to you here, but it is utter gobbledygook. None of us would figure out what it meant. And it has down at the bottom, it says, well, if you send in information about a change in your income which caused your benefits to do this and that, and it calculated this way, you're going to have to basically send us that information again next month. right? And people don't get that far. And so they don't figure it out, so they get dropped. So instead, the fellows built an application that simply texts somebody a message that says, you know, there's a problem with your benefits, call the office, right? Much, much higher compliance that actually saves money for the city because they don't have to process all these applications over again. We built a similar process in New Jersey for court dates, letting people know about that, similar. Anyway, Jake Solomon, who's one of the fellows who worked on this, wrote a really inspiring piece on Medium called People Not Data, on disdain and empathy in civic tech. It's really a must-read piece because it really gets across how heart-rendingly important it is that we build these services with user needs first. Finally, we have a program at Code for America called the Code for America Accelerator. We also have an incubator for projects that grow out of the fellowship, where we're really trying to build a network of companies that will address some of the technology issues with government. So both the fellowship has an application deadline at the end of June, and the accelerator actually has one in the next couple of weeks. So I want to end with this notion of why government is so important. We tend to disdain it because of the poisonous politics, but it's a hugely important part of our society, particularly for the people who have the least in our society. And Abraham Lincoln, I think, said it really, really well. He said, the legitimate object of government is to do for the people what needs to be done, but which they cannot, by individual effort, do at all or do so well for themselves. And we, as technologists, have a responsibility to give back, to actually make a difference in building digital services and rebuild trust in government so that it can do the job that we need it to do going forward. Thank you very much. I'm ending with a few comments about how you can help. Okay.